Welcome to the Office of the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra. I'm Ashley Hall, host and producer of the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra podcast.
I'm Greg Scholl, a trombone player in the Vancouver Symphony, and this is Da Capo.
Let's start talking about maybe the granddaddy of them all, Johann Sebastian Bach.
Sure, J.S. Bach was the granddaddy of the Baroque, that's for sure. And in a moment when we talk about Vitale, we'll talk more about the Baroque period, but we're talking about the 1600s. Bach was born in Eisenach, which is part of Saxony, in 1685, and he was part of a huge family. In fact, J.S. Bach himself was the youngest of 8 children. He traced his own lineage back all the way to a person named Wyatt Bach. That was as far as he could figure it out. So Bach's father was Johann Ambrosius Bach. His father was Christoph Bach. His father was Johannes Bach, on and on. Mm-hmm. And it went to this guy named Wyatt Bach, who was a bread maker in Hungary. This ancestor's greatest pleasure in life was to play the cittern, which is this sort of stringed instrument, kind of like a large mandolin. Mm-hmm. And this was the beginning of musical inclination for his children and for the children that came later. In fact, the kids would go with him to his grinding mill, and while the flour or the grains were grinding, he would play the cittern for them, and did this on a daily basis. And sometimes people credit that towards a sort of a rhythmic inclination that these composers ended up having.
Just play along to the metronome of the millstone.
That's right. It's kind of like a counterpoint or a bass line going on underneath those cittern tunes. The Bach family was very musically fertile. We're talking about 200 years of just one respected musician after another.
Quite a dynasty.
At his time, Bach didn't stand out. He was one person in this sort of panoply of composers from this famous family. And all over Germany, there were family members that were in musical positions with courts and churches. Bach family members placed in important positions. They really had this network, and when they heard of an opening in a city, they all got together and contacted the people in charge to make sure that a Bach would be appointed. And pretty soon there were dozens of them all over the place.
Just proliferating Bachs.
Yeah, they took over in a way. Bach's father was a highly respected church organist in Eisenach, but he died when Bach was just 10 years old. We don't know much about the childhood of J.S. Bach. When did his talent emerge? Did he have perfect pitch? Did he engage in training, and what kind? We just don't know those things. There aren't records of that. But we do know that he had a few positions and spent 27 years as a church cantor. This is not just a person who sings in church, but it's kind of like a church educator at this place called the St. Thomas School. And he was the organ and choir master at a church in Leipzig.
Mm-hmm. Is the reason that we don't know as much about his life maybe due more to the fact that he wasn't in his time necessarily as famous?
That's right. He was not a superstar. This was the Baroque period, the 17th century in Europe. Art was changing. Detail and color were becoming very much more important in paintings and sculpture and other things. There was this voluptuous sort of liveliness that was coming into art forms. This type of Baroque art packs in a lot of ideas, and this happened in music with modulations of key and dissonances and tools that composers were starting to use to ornament their music. And there were lots of people experimenting with that type of music, and Bach was one of them, one among many, and no one really recognized his genius at that time. People believe that he knew how good he was, but he didn't express it. He was kind of a stubborn and incorrigible, very sort of professional musician. He always was assertive, but in, some would say, passive-aggressive ways. For instance, if he was criticized for playing too long in church, which he was, then he would instantly change the very next service and play an incredibly, absurdly short amount of time. He sort of had to have the last word like that.
I see.
There are other things about Bach that are worth knowing. As a child, he stole a Pachelbel score from his older brother. His brother was Johann Christoph, and he kept this score out of Bach's hands. And every night, Bach figured out a way to get it out of this safe that his brother had by moving his hand through a grill or something like that. And every night for 6 months, he withdrew this thing and copied down as much as he could and then put it back. Well, eventually, Johann Christoph found out what he was doing and not only devised a different method of hiding the material from Bach, but stole the copy that Bach had made and destroyed it. So he was a little bit willing to bend the rules, at least, in order to find out more about the music of Pachelbel.
It sounds like, in addition to having this sort of musical dynasty, that brewed some rivalry as well.
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
Competing Bachs.
You can only imagine that these brothers and sisters, all who could play and write, were working on things and trying to keep them away from each other. Bach had conflicts with other people in the world, not just his family. He famously drew a sword on one of his students and attacked him. This is the composer of the St. Matthew Passion, sort of rolling around on the floor with a sword in a brawl. And I guess that's something that's frowned on, but it does make him sort of a hero. He disdainfully called a colleague a zippelfagottist, and this translates into a bassoonist who produces sounds like those of a nanny goat.
A nanny goat?
Yes, he threw his wig at an organist and yelled that the guy would be better off as a cobbler. And in fact, Bach was thrown in jail for 4 weeks at Weimar, basically for just complaining about everything too much. So he was a strong person and kind of a lot to deal with. And when we think of Bach, we have him on this pedestal, as he should be. His music is seen as, very austere and amazing, and it is amazing music. But Bach himself was kind of a rowdy guy. He did consider himself an old-fashioned composer, even though he lived at a time when music was changing pretty radically. He thought that he was kind of a pedant whose music was just pushed aside in favor of a lot of new stuff that was moving in the direction of what they call the style galant, where the music is becoming very graceful and seen as somewhat superficial. And this is music that his own son, Johann Christian, became very popular with in London in later years. But even though he was experimenting with these new forms and these new ideas, he still thought of himself as kind of an old-fashioned person and an old-fashioned composer.
You mentioned Maestro Vitale earlier. I have to admit, this is not a composer that I am familiar with at all.
He's not one of the most famous composers in the history of Western music. He is well known for the chaconne that's on the program today. Vitale was another composer from the Baroque era. One of the things that happened during this era was musical keys started to be established for a piece of music. You didn't just sit down and start writing music. There were thoughts put into what key should I use and what were the relationships between different keys in a piece of music. We owe that to the Baroque era. Also during the Baroque, musicians were expected to improvise, and that meant making up a melody for a piece and even making up the accompaniment. During Vitale's time, it would not be uncommon for the music to be handed out and there to be a melody and then just a sketch or maybe some numbers or a very not well written down bass line or accompaniment. And it didn't matter because the players could just look at that and they knew what they were supposed to do. That's sometimes called figured bass, where the chord structures or a bass line are included, but the musicians have to come up with everything else on their own.
Wow.
Vitale was one of these composers who worked at making music more dense and more full, more complicated. He's right in there with Handel and Telemann and Scarlatti and Vivaldi. These are famous composers that he had a lot in common with. He just wasn't as popular. And in turn, the Baroque sort of wound down and gave way to the classical period of Haydn and Mozart. But these dance forms, like the chaconne, were a huge part of Baroque composition. The chaconne that will be played today features this sort of stately dance and a slow rhythm. That's what the chaconne dance form is like, and that's the basis for this composition.
Well, speaking of our soloists today, one of our musicians is playing an oboe solo. And as we have been enjoying discussing the different instruments that we're hearing in the concerts, let's talk a little about the oboe.
Yeah, the oboe is a fascinating instrument. The soloist will be performing a piece by Vaughan Williams, and we've talked about him already this year. It's nice to have an oboe soloist with the orchestra. The oboe is in the double reed family of instruments, along with the bassoon. And this means that it uses a folded reed as opposed to a single reed like in a clarinet or saxophone. We talked about clarinets earlier this year. A clarinet makes sound by this thin reed that is made out of cane or grass, which I think is called Arundo domax. Oh. They cut this thing really thin and it's spliced onto a mouthpiece, if you will, and the clarinet player blows on this thing and that reed starts to vibrate and shake and move against that mouthpiece, and that creates a buzzing noise, if you will, that is the right frequency for that instrument, and it makes a musical sound. Well, double reed instruments like oboes and bassoons also have a reed, but it's not banging against part of the instrument. It's the piece of cane, if you will, or grass, is folded over, and then on the end that you blow on, which is the folded part, they cut a bit off the end so that you can blow through it, and the two halves of the grass reed are vibrating against each other.
Sort of like vocal cords.
That's exactly right. That's a perfect analogy. And so as this thing shakes, it makes a high-pitched noise or a low-pitched noise in the case of a bassoon, and that is modified through the instrument itself. And that is what is creating the vibrating column of air, if you will, that makes the oboe sound. Mm-hmm. Those notes are changed because as the oboist covers up or releases keys, opening holes in the length of the oboe, the air column length changes, and that makes the pitch go up or down. Mm-hmm. These reeds are very fragile and hard to make. You don't see very many beginning players making their own reeds. They just buy them in stores. But eventually, oboe players, bassoon players have to have some training that takes a while, and they have to practice making these reeds for themselves. In fact, if you study these instruments in college, music majors have to take lessons with their music instructor, and that's where they learn etudes and how to play and techniques and everything else. Double reed players also have to take a reed making class that also might meet once a week, where they have to practice the techniques and the tools and the instruments that are used for making these reeds. It's a big deal.
That's really remarkable.
My spouse is a bassoonist, double reed player, and she names her reeds, and they all have to have three-letter names. Because that's all the room there is to write on the end of this thing. Okay. She plays in the Vancouver Symphony, and her reeds are called things like Flo and Bob, any three-letter
Bob the Reed.
The oboe itself is made out of wood. Cocobolo wood or rosewood are often used. There are some other kinds of wood that can be used to make oboes, and then the more inexpensive versions are made out of plastic. Mm-hmm. An oboe is such a small instrument, but it can cut through a pretty large section of the orchestra. So, of course, all our favorite classical pieces, there's many famous oboe solos all along the way. Mm-hmm. And I've often thought the oboe is an interesting instrument because the players sometimes have to exhale before they can take a breath to inhale. In other words, these giant trombones and things we play, we're constantly running out of air. It's a whole thing. But sometimes you'll see oboists take a big breath and begin to play, and they can only have so much air go through the oboe at one time. And so it builds up, and it's that thing sometimes when you're holding your breath, you have to exhale before you can inhale. They aren't necessarily always starving for air. Sometimes they have to let some out before they can start again.
Well, we had some very early music for part of this program, but we have a couple of more recent composers as well. Let's talk about Samuel Barber.
Great idea. It's a sign of good programming to have not only some older pieces in this program, it's music from the Baroque, but to have some things from the 20th and now 21st century is available to us. It's a sign of a healthy orchestra to have music from different periods on a program. Samuel Barber is a famous American composer. His most well-known work is the Adagio for Strings, which will be played today. He also wrote a piano concerto, which is somewhat famous and still done pretty often. Samuel Barber grew up in the United States, and many of his pieces are informed by things in the United States. He wrote a piece that we've played in the Vancouver Symphony. It was some years ago called Knoxville, summer of 1915.
Beautiful.
It's a great piece based on some pretty spectacular writing by the American novelist James A.G.
If our patrons at home want to hear that performance, it's actually in an episode of the podcast.
That's really good to know. I would suggest everyone check it out. It's a remarkable piece of music, and that novel is very well written as well. Barber started out early, as a lot of these composers did. At age 10, he tried to write an opera called The Rose Tree. By age 12, he was an organist in a local church, and by 14, he entered the Curtis Institute. This is a music conservatory in Philadelphia. He entered Curtis as a triple prodigy in composition, voice, and piano as well, and went into his 20s just writing a whole lot of music. He's one of these people that always knew he was going to be a musician. I found a letter, an excerpt from a letter that he wrote to his mother at age 9. I'd like to just read it for you. Dear Mother, I have written this to tell you my worrying secret. Now don't cry when you read it, because it is neither yours nor my fault. I suppose I will have to tell it now without any nonsense. To begin with, I was not meant to be an athlete. I was meant to be a composer and will be, I'm sure. I'll ask you one more thing. Don't ask me to try and forget this unpleasant thing and go play football. Please, sometimes I've been worrying about this so much that it makes me mad. Not very mad.
Oh, that's so sweet.
A cute letter from a 9-year-old Samuel Barber. So he knew he was going to write music even as a very young person, and that's exactly what he did.
That's remarkable.
Through his 20s, he wrote all kinds of pieces. The Adagio for String was written in 1938. And this was first performed by Arturo Toscanini and the NBC Orchestra. And at that time, it was very rare for that orchestra to perform music at all by an American composer.
Wow. Yeah, it's just a beautiful piece. I'm sure that everyone in our audience tonight has had the occasion to hear it, whether they knew it or not.
For sure.
It's
They've
everywhere.
heard it in a movie or a television program. I mean, it's been used for a lot of different things. It was played at FDR's funeral. It was played after the assassination of John Kennedy. It's in movies like Platoon and The Elephant Man. It was a big hit for Samuel Barber, and for sure is his most well-known piece. There's also something worth mentioning, which is a technique that you could see when the musicians play this piece, and that's called free bowing. When violins play in a section, or other stringed instruments as well, you'll notice that their bows always move in the same directions while they're playing. At least that's the way it's supposed to be. And there's a reason for that. It's not just that's the way they read it. They make decisions, I think, that everyone's going to do it a certain way, and usually it's the section leader who determines what the bowings are going to be. That's to keep it sounding a certain way, and I think there might also be some visual cues that are sort of important associated with that bowing. So you want them all to be moving together, and I suppose once in a while you can see one bow moving in a different direction than the others, and that's certainly not the end of the world. I'm sure it happens here and there. But it's rare to see them all moving in different directions. And at the sort of apex of the musical development of Adagio for strings, they get to this long fermata, or a held note, the sort of high note, the climax of the piece. It goes on for quite a while. And at that point, the score indicates free bowing, so you'll see them all start to go sort of at their own pace through that thing. And since it's not a passage where they need to change notes together, the phrasing doesn't get messed up like it would if they were doing that during a different type of melody. And the result is what you hear. It's this really shimmering, sort of ringing kind of sound that occurs. It's a violin section that's playing with free bowing sounds very different than a violin section where they're all doing the same thing. And Barber knew that, of course, and that's why he wrote it that way, so that when you get to that point in the piece, you just get this sound that is very powerful. It's really the most powerful part of that piece. And then, of course, everything stops, and we play again very soft. So there's some drama there.
It is a very dramatic piece.
Unfortunately for Barber, he spent his last years in isolation. He suffered from depression, and he suffered from alcoholism. His music is very reflective and contemplative, but it's not necessarily morbid or unhappy music. It's just serious music, and he has a very distinct voice. You know, he sort of forged his own lyrical and romantic style, and it's held up well over the years. Maybe better than any other American composer, excepting Aaron Copland and perhaps Leonard Bernstein, I don't know. During the 20th century, when Barber was writing this music, people were composing with all kinds of new crazy tools. Polytonality, where you have two key signatures or two tone centers going at once in the same piece, creating a lot of dissonance. Atonality, where you have atonal or dissonant music that is all dissonant. 12-tone techniques were being used, where you can't use a note twice until you've used the other 11 notes, like a mathematical type of approach. Jazz, neoclassicism, all these different things were being used and employed. Barber didn't really lock into any of those things. He borrowed a little bit here and there, but he sort of stuck to his own long melodic lines and just very rich textures, which seemed to leave audiences very fat and happy at the end of the concert.
Speaking of more contemporary composers, on the program we also have beloved by me, Benjamin Britten.
Oh, I didn't know you were a Britten fan. I would have done a little more homework if I had known that.
Well, I had the occasion to perform in his Ceremony of Carols at one point, and it was a wonderful experience.
He wrote so many different kinds of works, including 14 operas, other types of vocal music, orchestral pieces, chamber pieces. Benjamin Britten really wrote for a lot of different ensembles and a lot of different types of music.
Absolutely.
His best-known works include the opera Peter Grimes, this piece called The War Requiem, and of course the orchestral showpiece, The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra.
Now, unlike Bach, we happen to know quite a bit about Britten's life, and he's known for having quite the personality.
That's for sure. He was kind of an iconic figure. He was one of the last composers exclusively brought up on live music, and that might have affected his musical perspectives and the things that he said and wrote about music. And by that I mean, in his world, he was one of the last composers that were brought up with this idea that if you wanted to hear some kind of music, you had to go out and hear someone playing it, or you had to play it yourself. Now, in those years, he did start music lessons, but he still couldn't listen to recordings of music because his father refused to have a gramophone or record player in the house and wouldn't even allow a radio to be in the house. So Britten kind of grew up a little bit isolated from the thing that he was drawn to, and that might have led to his sort of, insular approach towards artistic opinions. He was something of a hypochondriac, but he did suffer some illnesses as a young person, and he can be described as judgmental, but I think it's more just he was very confident and sort of sure of his opinions. And that shows also in his music. It's very clear and confident writing. There doesn't seem to be any time where we're wondering what he's up to. Britten has been described as neo-romantic, and so if you think of the Romantic period, you think of the music of Beethoven and Chopin and Schumann and people like this. This came after the Classical period. And in this Romantic period, artists, not just musicians, started trying to get at what was really going on beneath the surface of things. Were there emotions and feelings and things of that nature that could be expressed through art? And of course, the modern era sort of started to move away from that, and music became more abstract. And these things that we were just talking about, atonality and 12-tone writing and neoclassicism and all these things, started to move away from that Romantic period. This is just sort of the way the pendulum swings in art. Well, Britten was one of these people that turned back to Romanticism and said, we're not going to compose music like that, but our music will be informed by that. And you can hear that. It doesn't sound Germanic or something along those lines, but you can hear the way the music is assembled. It has these sort of, I'll call them romantic building blocks, things that wouldn't be out of place in something like a Schumann symphony. It's just the tonality and everything is different. The way the music is put together is similar to the Romantics, and that's why they call him a neo-romantic. He blended that with what's called eclecticism, this sort of new way of looking at art and using modern tools.
So in 1939, I believe, he took a rather significant journey to the United States.
That's right. He came to the United States in 1939 with his partner. They left Europe in part because there was a lot of unrest in Europe and people were getting nervous, and it seemed like a good time perhaps to go to the USA. Now, that's not to say they were running away. In fact, they went to the British ambassador once they were here after the war fully broke out because they were feeling guilty and they thought this is the time we should probably go back home. And this ambassador convinced them, no, you need to stay. This is the time you need to stay for various reasons. And so Britten lived in the United States until 1942 or 43. And during that time, he spent time listening to and studying and meeting Aaron Copland, who was already a friend of his. But one thing that happened to Britten while he was in the United States is he was able to hear or see these premieres of new Copland pieces like Billy the Kid.
I find the piece performed today quite charming, the Simple Symphony, because he based it upon writings he did as a boy, which is just adorable.
Yeah, well, and he's another one like Barber. I think he knew early on, even though he wasn't allowed to listen to music at the house, he knew early on what he was going to do. And you're right, it's a charming piece, and I hope everyone enjoys the Vancouver Symphony version of it today.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us. Please enjoy the show.